The Life of David Livingston, Part 37. Some of the numerous rivers which in this region flow into Lualaba, Lualaba are covered with living vegetable bridges, a species of dark, glossy-leaved grass, with its roots and leaves felts itself into a mat. That's not a verb you hear anymore. Felting, like to felt something. Felts itself into a mat that covers the whole stream. When stepped upon, it yields 12 or 15 inches, and that amount of water rises upon the leg. At every step, the foot has to be raised high enough to place it on the unbent mass in front. This high stepping fatigues like walking on deep snow. Here and there, holes appear which we could not sound with a stick 6 feet long. They gave the impression that anywhere one might plump through and finish the chapter. Where the water is shallow, the lotus, or sacred lily, sends its roots to the bottom and spreads its broad leaves over the floating bridge so as to make believe that the mat is its own, but the grass referred to is the real felting and supporting agent, for it often performs duty as bridge where no lilies even grow. The bridge is called by Manyema Kintefewetefewe, as if he who first coined it was grasping for breath after plunging over a mile of it. Between each district of Manyema, large belts of the primeval forest still stand. Into these the sun, though vertical, cannot penetrate except by sending down at midday thin pencils of rays into the gloom. The rainwater stands for months in stagnant pools made by the feet of elephants, and the dead leaves decay on the damp soil and make the water of the numerous rivulets of the color of strong tea. The climbing plants, from the size of whipcord to that of a man of war's hawser, are so numerous the ancient path is the only passage. When one of the giant trees falls across the road, it forms a wall breast high to be climbed over, and the mass of tangled ropes brought down makes cutting a path round it a work of time which travelers never undertake. At this time, Dr. Livingston was not persuaded that the Manyema were men eaters. Toward the conclusion of this letter, to the conclusion of his letter to Lord Stanley, he thus describes them: "I lived in what may be called the Tipperary of Manyema, and they are certainly a bloody people among themselves, but they are very far from being in appearance like the ugly Negroes of the West Coast. Finely formed heads are common, and generally men and women are vastly superior to the slaves of Zanzibar or elsewhere. We must go deeper than phrenology to account for their low moral tone. If they are cannibals, they are not ostentatiously so. The neighboring tribes all assert that they are man-eaters, and they themselves languishingly admit the charge. But they like to impose on the credulous, and they showed the skull of a recent victim to horrify one of my people. I found it to be the skull of a gorilla, though, or Soko, the first I knew of its existence here, and this they do eat. If I had believed a tenth of what I heard from traders, I might never have entered the country. Their people told tales with shocking circumstantiality, as if of eyewitness, that could not be committed to paper, or even spoken about beneath the breath. Indeed, one wishes them to vanish from memory. I have not yet been able to make up my mind whether the Manyema are cannibals or not. I have offered goods of sufficient value to tempt any of them to call me to see a cannibal feast in the dark forests where these orgies are said to be held, but hitherto in vain. All the real evidence yet obtained would elicit from a Scotch jury the verdict only of not proven. The second dispatch, a later year, is devoted to the expression of thanks to Lord Clarendon on account of the expedition of search under Mr. Young, of which an account has already been given, to an explanation of Ali Musa's story of the explorer's death, and an earnest request that the money expended on him and his fellow impostors might be regained. The third document of the series, being also a letter to Lord Clarendon, presents an account of Dr. Livingston's explorations and views on the watershed of the Nile more in extensio, where anywhere else given. It is certainly one of the most interesting and valuable contributions to modern science. The readers of this volume cannot but feel that a large share of this interesting document may appropriately be quoted here. Quote, I have ascertained that the watershed of the Nile is a broad upland between the 10 degrees and 12 degrees south latitude from 4,000 to 5,000 feet above sea level. Mountains stand on it at various points, which, though not apparently very high, are between 6,000 and 7,000 feet actual altitude. The watershed is over 700 miles in length from east to west. The springs that rise on it are almost innumerable. That is, it would take a large part of a man's life to count them. A bird's eye view of the same parts of the watershed would resemble the frost vegetation on window panes. They all begin in an ooze at the head of a slightly depressed valley. A few hundred yards down the quantity of water from oozing earthen sponge forms a brisk perennial burn or brook, a few feet broad and deep enough to require a bridge. These are the ultimate or primary sources of the great rivers that flow to the north in the Great Nile Valley. The primaries unite and form streams in general larger than the Isis at Oxford or Avon at Hamilton, and may be called secondary sources. They never dry, but unite again into four large lines of drainage, and the headwaters or mains of the River of Egypt. These four are each called by the natives Lulalaba, which, if not pedantic, may be spoken of as lacustrine rivers, extant specimens of those which in prehistoric times abounded in Africa and which in the south are still called by Bechuanas Melapo, in the north by Arabs as wadis, both words meaning the same thing, riverbed in which no water ever flows. Two of the four great rivers mentioned fall into the central Lualaba or Webb's Lake River, and then we have but two main lines of drainage as depicted nearly by Ptolemy. In passing over 6 miles of latitude, I waded 32 primary sources from calf to waist deep, and requiring from 20 minutes to an hour and a quarter to cross stream and sponge. This would give about one source to every 2 miles. A Swahili friend, in passing along part of the lake Bangawelo during 6 days, counted 22 from thigh waist deep. This lake is on the watershed, for the village at which I observed on its northwest shore was a few seconds into 11 degrees south. I tried to cross it in order to measure the breadth accurately. The first stage to an inhabited island was about 24 miles. From the highest point here, the tops of the trees, evidently lifted by the mirage, could be seen on the second stage and the third stage. The mainland was said to be as far as this beyond it. but my canoemen had stolen the canoe and got a hint that the real owners were in pursuit and got into a flurry to return home. The length of this lake is, at a very moderate estimate, 150 miles. It gives forth a large body of water in the Luapala, yet lakes are in no sense sources, for no large river begins in a lake. But this and others serve as important purpose in the phenomena of the Nile. It is one large lake, and unlike the Okara, which, according to Swahili, who Swahili, who traveled long in our company, is three or four lakes run into one huge Victoria Nyanza, gives out a large river which, on departing out of Moero, is still larger. These men had spent many years east of Okara and could scarcely be mistaken in saying that of the three or four lakes, only one gives off its water to the north. The White Nile of Speke, less by a full half than a shire out of Nyasa, can scarcely be named in comparison with the central or Webb's Lualaba of from 2,000 to 6,000 yards in relation to the phenomena of the Nile. The structure and economy of the watershed answer very much to the same end as the great lacustrine rivers, but I cannot at present copy a lost dispatch which explained that. The mountains on the watershed are probably what Ptolemy, for reasons now unknown, called the Mountains of the Moon. From their basis, I found that the springs of the Nile do unquestionably arise. This is just what Ptolemy put down, and it is and is true geography. We must accept the fountains, and nobody but Philistines will reject the mountains, though we cannot conjecture the reason for the name. Before leaving the subject of the watershed, I may add that I know about 600 miles of it, but I am not satisfied, for unfortunately the 700th mile is most interesting of the whole. I have a very strong impression that in the last 100 miles of the fountains of the Nile, mentioned to Herodotus by the secretary of Minerva in the city of Sais, do arise, not like all the rest, from oozing earthen sponges, but from the earthen mound, and half the water flows northward to Egypt, the other half south to inner Ethiopia. These fountains, at no great distance off, become large rivers, though at the mound they are not more than 10 miles apart. That is, one fountain rising on the northeast of the mound becomes Bartle Ferrer's Lualaba, and it flows into one of the lakes proper, Camalolondo, of the central line of drainage. Webb's Lualaba, the second fountain rising on the northwest, becomes Young's Lualaba, which, passing through Lake Lincoln and becoming Loki or Loembe, and joining the central line, goes north to Egypt. The third fountain on the southwest, Palmerston's, becomes the Liambaya or Upper Zambezi, while the fourth, Oswell's fountain, becomes the Kaufe and falls into Zambezi in inner Ethiopia. More time has been spent in the exploration than I ever anticipated. Many a weary foot I trod ere I got a clear idea of the drainage of the great Nile Valley. The most intelligent natives and traders thought that all the rivers of the upper part of that valley flowed into Tanganyika, but the barometers told me that to do so, the water would have to flow uphill. The great rivers and the great lakes all make their waters converge into the deep trough of the valley, which is a full inch of barometer lower than the upper Tanganyika. Let me explain, but in no boastful style, the mistakes of others who have bravely striven to solve the ancient problem, and it will be seen that I have cognate reasons for following the painful, plodding investigation of its conclusion to its conclusion. Poor Speke's mistake was a foregone conclusion. When he discovered the Victoria Nyassa, he at once jumped to the conclusion that therein lay the sources of the river of Egypt, 20,000 square miles of water. Confused by sheer immensity, Ptolemy's small lake, Kolok, is a more correct representation of the actual size of that one of 3 or 4 lakes, which alone sends out its outflow to the north. Its name is Okara. Lake Kavirondo is 3 days distant from it, but connected by a very narrow arm. Lake Nyabash or Nebash is 4 days from Kavirondo. Baringo is 10 days distant and discharges by a river, the Nagaralabash, to the northeast. These 3 or 4 lakes, which have been described as by several intelligent Swahili who have lived for many years on their shores, were run into one of huge Victoria Nyanza. But no sooner did Speke and Grant turn their faces to this lake to prove that it contained the Nile fountains than they turned their backs to the springs of the river of Egypt, which are between 400 and 500 miles south of the most southerly portion of the Victoria Lake. Every step of their heroic and really splendid achievement of following the river down took them further and further from the sources that they actually sought. But for the devotion to the foregone conclusion, the sight of the little White Nile as unable to account for the great river, they must have turned off to the west down into down into the deep trough of the great valley, and there found lacustrine rivers amply sufficient to account for the Nile and all its phenomena. But all that is in modern times and in common modesty be fairly claimed is the rediscovery of what had sunk into oblivion, like the circumnavigation of Africa by the Phoenician admirals of one of the pharaohs about 600 BC. He was not believed because he reported that in passing around Libya he had the sun on his right hand. This, to us who have gone around the Cape from east to west, stamps his tale as genuine. The predecessors of Ptolemy probably gained their information from men who visited this very region, for in the 2nd century of our era he gave in substance what we now find to be genuine geography. The geographical results of 4 arduous trips in different directions in the Manyema country were briefly as follows. The great river, Webb's Lualaba, in the center of the Nile Valley, makes a great bend to the west soon after leaving Lake Moero of at least 180 miles. Then, turning to the north for some distance, it makes another large sweep west of about 120 miles, in the course of which about 30 miles of southing are made. It then draws round to the northeast, receives the Lamani or Loki, a large river which flows from Lake Lincoln. After the Union, a large lake is formed with many inhabited islands in it, still but this still has to be explored. It is the fourth large lake in the central line of drainage and can't be Lake Albert for assuming Speke's longitude of Ujiji to be pretty correct and my reckoning not enormously wrong. The great central lacustrine river is about 5 degrees west of upper and lower Tanganyika.